The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. This week we're taking a look back at prehistory for a glimpse of our planet before there were all these Homo sapiens everywhere. Later in the hour, we'll speak to Junior Skeptic editor Daniel Loxton about his new kids' book, Ankylosaur Attack. But first, let's find out what life was like for the hominids that eventually became modern humans. I'm talking to Brian Fagan, emeritus professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Born in England, Brian spent several years doing fieldwork in Africa, and he's the author of several books on climate history, as well as the Oxford Companion to Archaeology. He also wrote Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You say that Neanderthals have kind of been the victims of celebrity gossip. How so?
The Neanderthals are fascinating people. They have really attracted scientific fascination for well over 1.5 centuries. And their fascination began with the stereotype that they were cave people and dragged their women around by their long hair and had clubs and were the epitome of savagery. And this was very much supported by a French scientist back in 1908, who described a Neanderthal skeleton from a cave in France, which was unfortunately the skeleton of somebody with chronic arthritis. And he described them as brutish, shambling people, which we now know, thanks to another century of work, is a very false stereotype. They were squat, adapted to extreme cold, very nimble, extremely strong, and very, very skilled hunters. The only real difference between them and us, beyond obvious anatomical details, was the fact that they did not have the intellectual and mental or cognitive abilities that we have. And this creates quite a chasm between them and us.
Why do you think we're so fascinated by every new development about them?
It's one of these things. If you look at the ancient Egyptians, literally an Egyptologist finds a tomb and the world sits up and takes notice. Somebody decides that the end of the Maya world will come in 2012. The world sits up. You mention Neanderthals and people immediately think of archaic savages. How were they like us? Were they the same? Were they different? People know now that Neanderthals and modern humans, Cro-Magnons, lived in Europe alongside one another. Did they have sex? Did they interact? What did the one learn from the other? These have become sort of media fascinations in a world of 24/7 news. And for some reason, they've hit the sunny bone. And I kind of track what's going on. And I would say there were 2 or 3 Neanderthal stories a week, most of them ridiculous, and many of them sent out by university public relations offices who should know better. Cumulative extra knowledge we acquire is very small, and it's very, very rare that there is, in this day and age, a really major discovery.
Well, let's try to set the record straight. Let's start with some definitions, actually. So we're talking about Neanderthals, but we're also talking about Cro-Magnons. So Neanderthals existed from when to when?
Neanderthals are what many people call archaic Homo sapiens, archaic humans. We don't know exactly when they came into being, but they seem to have appeared somewhere around figure 300,000 years ago, and they became extinct again, it's a matter of controversy, probably around 30,000 years ago. So it's a long chronological span. The Cro-Magnons are anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens. They're you and I. We are the wise people. We think, we reason, we plan, we innovate, we love, we hate, and so on. And the latest research, mainly from genetics, suggests that our remote ancestors, modern humans, emerged in Africa somewhere after 200,000 years ago, by which time the Neanderthals, who'd evolved from much earlier archaic humans in Europe, were well established in their homeland. And the Cro-Magnons, and it's really a rather artificial label, which I'll come to in a moment, the modern humans appear to have arrived in the Near East and settled there around 60, 70,000 years ago and moved into Europe around 48,000 years ago. Why then do we call them Cro-Magnons? The story is of small numbers of modern humans moving into a continent inhabited by small numbers of archaic humans and then taking over in a relatively short period of time. Where there is really no reliable label for them except anatomically modern humans, or what they often call AMH, which is yawn-inducing by any standards. And back in the 19th century, a French archaeologist named them Cro-Magnons after a rock shelter near the teeny village of Les Azy in southwestern France, where you really should go if you have a chance, because it's not only wonderful cave art and scenery, but the food is out of this world. And the cave was called Cro-Magnon. And I think it was about 1858, they found two modern human skeletons in a rock shelter called Cro-Magnon at Les Azy, and they've been known as Cro-Magnons or Cro-Magnon ever since. And the label is kind of rejected by academics as being too generic, and they're absolutely correct. But it's awfully convenient if you are telling a story, and my book tells a story about these people. So I call them Cro-Magnons. Have I been criticized for it? Not yet that I've seen, so we're okay.
Maybe tell me what the Neanderthals were like.
The Neanderthals, and it's very important, we have this fixation about Neanderthals. Mm. The Neanderthals, it's important to realize there were very, very few of them. They were scattered widely, and probably the densest concentration of them was in sheltered valleys in southwestern France. They were people who apparently were much of the year on the move. They lived entirely off game animals and wild plant foods, but for much of the time they were in Europe, the climate was extremely cold, so most of their diet must have come from meat. And it's very interesting that apparently a great deal of their hunting focused on larger animals like bison, which are very, very formidable prey. You see, the thing about Neanderthals, different to Cro-Magnons, is that their hunting technology was extremely simple. All they had was stone-tipped or wooden spears and probably clubs. Now, if you're going to kill a bison, you've got to get really close to it to have the chance of a fatal blow. Unlike a bow and arrow, you can stand a little further back. And to do this, they must have had extraordinary stalking abilities. And to kill one of these animals, they must literally have had to jump on its back and spear it between the shoulders to hit the heart. So you're talking about people of extraordinary strength and of great adeptness who knew their environments backwards. They lived in hunting territories which they were well defined. They probably had some form of communication, not fully fluent speech like we have. What their social organization or religious beliefs were, we don't know. If any, they were probably rather limited. And it's been suggested that they communicated, for example, by humming. And there's a scientist in England who has attempted to reconstruct Neanderthal music. But they were very simple folk, very inconspicuous. And it's interesting that when the newcomers came in, the number of times you actually physically saw a Neanderthal in your lifetime may have been once or twice, if then, because they were very thin on the ground.
Well, you've mentioned intelligence a few times already. What was their intelligence like?
If you look at us, let's start there. We have an ability to plan. We look at things in the long term, and we're very ingenious at producing solutions. Now, this is really a speculative statement because, as you well know, speech is transitory, so are religious beliefs, so are intellectual capacities. They are not set in stone or wood.
Right.
And the only clues we can get to how the Neanderthals thought is really from their technology. And the most striking thing, Desiree, is that over 300,000 years, their technology practically remained unchanged. Everywhere. There were little local variations, and this strongly suggests that they lacked the brilliant innovative abilities of the Cro-Magnons. Why do we know this? For example, because the Cro-Magnons invented the needle. The needle, believe it or not, is one of the most important artifacts ever invented by humanity. Why? Because it enabled people to make tailored, sewn clothing, to make layers, so that in environments like Ice Age Europe, or like Canada today, where you have these dramatic shifts in temperature between summer and winter, you can put on and take off layers, which is what mountaineers, cross-country skiers, sailors, backpackers do today. And this is an invention of the Cro-Magnon. That required mental flexibility and the ability to think through the whole process. All the Neanderthals did was drape skins, as far as we can tell. So you're talking about a dramatic difference in modern humans.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. I'm talking to Brian Fagan, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, author of Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans. So, what do we know about the day-to-day lives of the Cro-Magnons then?
We know a considerable amount. Cro-Magnons were anatomically like us. They had an absolutely brilliant ability to adapt to rapidly changing temperatures. I mean, we have this image of the Ice Age as a period of solid deep freeze. In fact, recent climatological research has shown that the climate changed constantly. There were periods, maybe 25,000 years ago, when the climate was relatively modest. 18,000 years ago, Europe was in a very, very harsh deep freeze. And the result is that you had to be very adept, and all knowledge was passed from one generation to another by word of mouth. And the most striking thing about the Cro-Magnons is, firstly, the remarkable diversity of their toolkit, much of which had specialized purposes. I mentioned the needle. Another one is the antler point put on wooden spearheads mounted, which would then presumably have been coated with poison. And these things were lethal. And they invented an artifact called a spear thrower, which is really a hook which enables you to propel very accurately a spear with much greater force over slightly longer distances. And it's clear that they were able to hunt a much wider range of animals. And by 18,000 years ago, and a little bit after that, there was strong evidence that they were from animal bones, not only hunting animals like bison and horse and woolly rhino and all the famous Ice Age bestiary, but they were taking dozens of Arctic foxes for clothing. They were hunting rabbits. They were hunting animals small and large, even birds, and they were taking salmon in rivers where there were salmon runs. These were extremely versatile hunters who relied again predominantly on game, although they must have made use of plant foods, although much of this does not survive. Much different from the Neanderthals. Much more sophisticated, much more adaptable, and much more able to swing with climatic punches than their predecessors.
But their days weren't just filled with hunting. They also had art.
They had art. And one of the great discoveries of 19th century archaeology was the discovery of Cro-Magnon art at the Altamira cave in northern Spain, where there are those magnificent bison paintings. They've just opened a superb replica of them. And of course in Les Aisieux, where there are not only art on the walls, but portable artifacts as well. The images are familiar to many people. The big question is, why did they paint? Why did they engrave on walls? Why did they carve artifacts? And this is where you see the huge chasm between Neanderthals and modern humans. Because the most striking feature of many hunter-gatherer societies to this day, the Inuit, the San of Africa, the Australian Aborigines, all of them have elaborate, very sophisticated spiritual lives which are perpetuated by chant, by song, by recitation, and through art. They may deal with spiritual beings. They may deal with the distribution of water across the landscape. They may deal with hunting law. But the images on the cave walls weren't art for art's sake. They were part of an elaborate set of ritual beliefs which defined the world in which the Cro-Magnons lived in ways the Neanderthals never did. Because they must have thought of animals, as many hunter-gatherer societies do today, as living beings, animals with power. And in some of the caves you see impressions of the hands of the hunters on the walls, men and women and children, as if they are drawing power from the hidden spiritual animals behind the walls where the paintings appear. Because it's important to realize that in most hunter-gatherer societies, and indeed subsistence farming societies, Native American societies, there is no gap between the living and the spiritual world. They are a continuum. And some of the most powerful individuals in these societies were men or women of power. These were people who were perceived to have supernatural powers, who were able to transform themselves into mythic beasts, or were able to flow effortlessly, perhaps with the aid of hallucinogenic drugs, into the world of the supernatural. And it is believed by many people that Cro-Magnon art is really a tangible expression of all these beliefs, some of which defined hunting, others were initiation rituals, others were connected with fertility, and so on and so forth. And I must say, it is a very, very convincing way of interpreting the art. It is highly controversial, obviously, because we can't talk to them. But I think the evidence is coming together.
Well, and I think that's one of the problems with this is sometimes it does seem like speculation. Even the fact that they buried their dead. Do we know why that happened?
This is fascinating because there is controversy as to whether the Neanderthals actually buried their dead. I think they buried some of them. Burial for modern humans, of course, is much more common. And a lot of this is connected again with the relationship of the supernatural and a belief in the afterlife. And burial among the Cro-Magnons, to me, is a reflection of spiritual beliefs and beliefs in a spiritual realm where people, when they died, believed that they went into the same sort of existence they had on Earth, as living people, but as ancestors. And it's very striking. You get this sense of continuity. And this continuity is obviously closely wrapped up with the eternal truth of the hunter-gatherer life, of the early farming life. Winter, the quiet, dead period. Spring, the period of explosive growth, of the birth of animals. Summer, where there are plant foods and the game is plentiful and fat. Fall, where you attempt to lay in food for the lean months ahead. And this endless cycle goes round and round and round. And it's very easy to project from that into the notion of spring of birth, summer's growth and adulthood, fall as old age and winter as death, which repeats itself. So if you have this cyclical view of the world, it's very easy to think of ancestors. You become an ancestor and you simply keep the same cycle going in the spiritual world. And the relationship between ancestral figures and the living in many hunter-gatherer societies is central to human existence and extremely powerful. And I'm sure it was among the Cro-Magnons.
I think I could listen to you talk about this forever. But you have a wonderful way of thinking about this.
I immersed myself in this for 3 years.
You can tell. Is there anything else that you find particularly fascinating about the Cro-Magnon man? Or, I guess, something that lay people would find surprising?
Well, the reason I got into this book was partly because I had a wonderful editor in New York who encouraged me, and also because when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University in England, my first professor was an elderly Stone Age archaeologist called Miles Burkitt, who was not a particularly good archaeologist, and he wouldn't be upset if I said this. He's long dead, of course. But he was a brilliant storyteller, and he had been in the French caves working with a legendary French professor called the Abbé Breuil, who was a priest and a prehistorian, who copied much of the art using tracing paper and an acetylene lamp, flickering in the dark. And if you've seen these paintings flickering in candle or acetylene light, it's almost as if they came alive. And the reason I'm an archaeologist is because that guy told these stories and got me excited about it. He did this in the years before World War I, and he showed us pictures of him doing it with the old black and white lantern slides, which they put into a huge machine, clunk, clunk. And when you get images like that when you're young and impressionable as an undergraduate, you never forget them. And I always kept a vague interest in the Cro-Magnons and visited the caves. And when the chance came up to write about them, the biggest challenge was to be as exciting as Miles Burkitt had been. Because the thing we forget is you may have the art, but ultimately the evidence for these people is what they left behind. Broken animal bones, stone tools, bone tools, and endless layers of hearths, mostly in caves, which give a rather skewed view of everything because of the nature of them, and it's very, very difficult archaeology. And the literature on this was enormously challenging. So to turn this into a book that was intelligible to the lay reader was very, very difficult. And a couple of academics have reviewed the book and said that I am imaginative. I have no compunction about this, because what I have to do is not say that artifacts used were this and this and this and this. I have to tell people what it was like for women trapping Arctic geese and plovers by the side of a stream in the spring using simple traps. And you've got to reconstruct that, or how somebody got fitted with clothing. This is the challenge. And that was the fun of the book, making the past come alive, using science to do so.
We have an email question from Annie.
I read an article a few days ago that said that Neanderthals did not share our genetic inclination towards exploration. The reasoning was that Neanderthal remains haven't been found outside of Europe and Asia. They presumably had no ability or interest in building canoes. Homo sapiens explored their world due to our inherent spirit of adventure. Your thoughts?
I would agree with you. I think that's a very sane way of putting it. The most striking things about Neanderthals is how little they changed, how little their tools change, and presumably their territories. And they were very thin on the ground. And they didn't really have probably a great deal of incentive to explore. One of the most striking things about the Cro-Magnons is when they first arrived, there were very small numbers of them, and they seem to have spread rather rapidly. And it's almost as if they were exploring. And then later, large numbers of them came in. And an archaeologist in England has just very convincingly argued that one of the reasons the Neanderthals became extinct was simply that they were submerged by the large numbers of modern humans with much better technological and intellectual skills. And the most striking thing about modern humans is they expanded remarkably rapidly into nearly every environment on Earth. I mean, look at the figures. They were in Southeast Asia 75,000 years ago. They were in Siberia by 45,000 years ago. In Europe by 45,000 years ago. They crossed into Japan and China way early. They crossed into the Americas by 15,000 in every kind of imaginable environment. Why? Because they had the flexibility, the intellectual capabilities, the technological ability to innovate that enabled them to survive in every kind of environment imaginable. I think you are absolutely correct. They were adventurous, they were curious. Remember that some of the greatest scientists today are people whose greatest characteristic is their curiosity, their insatiable curiosity.
But to play devil's advocate, isn't that a bit of speculation, a fair bit of speculation? Because can we really get that far inside the Neanderthal mind?
It is entirely speculation.
Okay.
And the question asked me was a speculative question. Now, I'm not being defensive here. I think it was a great question. I think if we want to expand knowledge, we've got a number of things going on. We've got the scientific evidence, artifacts, environmental data, which today is incredibly fine-grained. We've got genetic evidence, which is getting more sophisticated every day. Then we've got the advances in archaeological theory and reasoning, which enable us to extrapolate responsibly, and I use the word responsibly, from this data. And lastly, we have what I call the big picture. That's where you connect the dots, and that's where some speculation always comes in. The big advance, which makes this less speculative, and this is particularly true in the last few years, is radiocarbon dating. It was invented in 1949, and today it is unbelievably sophisticated. Let me give you an example. They now recently have found that Polynesians living in the Southwest Pacific colonized the whole of eastern Polynesia. That is Tahiti, Hawaii, Easter Island, all those islands in about 100 years, after about AD 950. This is brand new stuff. It's revolutionized our view of this chapter of history. And that's the sort of thing that really stimulates speculation and imagination. At the risk of sounding defensive, and I don't want to, every word in Cro-Magnon, the book, is based on science. But from that, I extrapolate what I think is a reasonable picture.
I'm talking to Brian Fagan, author of Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans. And we'll be right back with more after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. To be a part of the discussion, call and record your question on our listener question line at Speak 73101. That's 773-257-3101. Long-distance charges may apply. Sunday nights at 6 Mountain Time, join our Ustream chat room to listen and ask questions as we record interviews live. Just click the Listen Online button at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also email your questions and comments to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, tweet us at Skeptical Radio. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. My guest today is Brian Fagan, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Brian is the author of several books on climate history, including the New York Times bestseller, The Great Warming, as well as People of Earth, A World Prehistory. We're talking today about Cro-Magnon, how the Ice Age gave birth to the first modern humans. Now, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons existed at the same time. So if you look at this from an entirely human perspective, we usually kind of have two options when we meet new groups, and that's war or trade. And I know I'm being overly simplistic, but how did these groups interact with each other?
This is one of those questions that really has triggered enormous amounts of speculation and has also caused widespread public interest. The reason it's called public interest, it's stimulated public interest, is twofold. One, it is the notion that one group of humans caused another to become extinct. And the second one, of course, is, did these two very different humans have sex? And this is really the question that intrigues the headlines than anything else. I think really there were a number of scenarios here. The first thing you have to realize is that the number of Neanderthals on the ground, as we said earlier, are very small. They were elusive, and in the book I call them the silent people. They were watchers. They were brilliant observers. They had to be, to kill animals. And I'm sure they spent a great deal of time observing the newcomers. Occasionally they must have met. They may have even traded with one another. For example, Neanderthals might have collected honey and been given skins. We don't know. There may have even occasionally been violence. But I'm sure that the Cro-Magnons were very, very careful because they knew the immense strength of the Neanderthals. They may have even communicated with grunts and signs, as you do when you have someone you don't understand the language of. But these encounters were fleeting, I'm sure. And in the final analysis, I don't think the Neanderthals were killed off by marauding Cro-Magnons. I think they were probably not competitive, were pushed out to the margins, and eventually each group got smaller and smaller as people died off. And remember that life expectancy was probably in your 20s and 30s. And eventually groups no longer were viable breeding units. And eventually, probably down in South Spain, the way it seems to be, they died out. Did the interaction involve anything more than that? Did it involve sex? There are people who claim that there are very small quantities of Neanderthal genes in some Cro-Magnon populations in the Near East. And it is claimed that there was some intercourse between them. Whether or not this is true, I think we need a great deal more research, but it certainly isn't out of the question. But the scenario I would paint of them is that the Neanderthals were shadowy people on the side, on the margins of people whose abilities were vastly superior and numbers grew rapidly to the point where the Neanderthals just literally faded away.
I found it really interesting, the fact that I think this is the first time I've heard it pointed out, but Cro-Magnons might not have even really registered that the Neanderthals were people just by their sense of smell. They might have smelled quite different.
Oh, they knew they were human beings. They knew they were different. And I would have suspected their body odor was different, and probably repulsive for all we know. It's very difficult for us to give an analogy because I've met people who've actually encountered groups who have never seen a white man before. I've done that myself. I've actually been to remote parts of Africa where the children had never seen a white person before. And it's a very bizarre experience because you look at these people and they are completely different and you have nothing in common except gestures. And I am sure that the Neanderthals or the Cro-Magnons had a name for them. They probably had folklore about them, and they probably had parameters as to how they behaved around them. But I think generally they regarded the Neanderthals not as competition, but as a form of human that was elusive, occasionally seen, and you kept out of the way of each other. Beyond that, really, we can't say much. But I'm pretty sure that their body odor and things like that would have been different.
Now, you mentioned DNA. Now, you say that Neanderthal DNA is about 99.7% identical to ours. Now, I was just thinking about that. Chimpanzees are about 96% identical. So what does that mean?
It means that a great deal of research is needed before we absolutely can define the difference between moderns and Neanderthals in genetic terms. There has been research done since I wrote the book, and to be perfectly honest, since I've spent the last 3 years working on a history of water, I'm not really in tune with it. But you hear both sides of this, that they were incompatible or they were very close. That there was considerable genetic similarity is beyond question. I really don't know at this point. It's changing so rapidly.
Well, you also wrote that Homo sapiens have evolved specific genes relating to cognitive function. So how did that happen?
We don't know. This is one of the great fascinating mysteries. The evidence suggests, such as it is, and it's only artifacts, that it probably happened in Africa about maybe 70,000 years ago. Anatomically, modern humans appeared much before that, people with the bones and appearance, but the mental abilities may have evolved much later. And all kinds of theories appear to account for this. And really, we don't know why it happened. But having said that, there are some pieces on the stage, as you might say, which are very fascinating. One of them is, or was, an absolutely epochal volcanic eruption of a mountain called Mount Toba in Sumatra in Indonesia, which blew into space 73,000 years ago and unleashed an enormous cloud of dust and volcanic ash, which probably, and some people believe it did, produced the equivalent of a nuclear winter for about 8 or 9 years. And one of the greatest areas of impact of this was India, the China Sea, parts of the Near East, and Africa. And Africa may have got extremely cold. The casualty rate among early modern human populations, who would have been very small, could have been very severe. There's huge argument about this. But I have a suspicion that the challenge of coping with these conditions may well have been one of the stimuli which led to the emergence of more advanced hunting methods, increased cooperation between people, better reasoning, and so on. All I can hope is that more research, particularly in southern Africa, where much of this data comes from, may well enable us to narrow this down a bit. But again, the trouble is, Desiree, we're dealing with the intangible.
Right.
We're dealing with people talking, people thinking, people passing knowledge from one generation to the next. It's terribly hard for us, being literate, and having been literate since we were kids, to comprehend a world where all knowledge passed by word of mouth, by gesture, by song, by chant, by recitation. And the most vivid example probably we have actually is ancient Egypt, where only a teeny proportion of the population was literate, where you see the endless hieroglyphs on the temples and so on. And these images were one way of passing information to a non-literate population from one generation to the next.
We have a question from David. I like this question.
At this point in Cro-Magnon research, how true to life was Jane Auel's Clan of the Cave Bear series?
A loaded question. Yeah. Jane Auel is a charming lady and a very, very talented writer. She has done a huge amount of research on The Cro-Magnons, I've actually met her and talked to her. She's a delightful person. But you have to realize that what she is actually writing is a series of romance novels. And romance novels are a genre. They're not a reconstruction of Cro-Magnon life based on science like Murray books are. They are stories of characters where the backdrop and the daily existence is the Cro-Magnons for a novel. And the novel has certain formulaic things which appear in it. Emotion, anger, violence, vivid sex, food, and these are books written as entertaining stories. What makes Jean Auel's books much better than most of the books in this genre is the thoroughness of her research. It is very thorough indeed. Does it reflect reality? Probably not.
Succinct response. You're tuned in to Skeptically Speaking. I'm here with Brian Fagan, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, author of Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans. Now, it doesn't go without notice that we don't see any Neanderthals or Cro-Magnons today. So why is that?
Did you ask if we don't see them?
Right. In real life, let's say.
We don't see any Neanderthals, but genetically, the Cro-Magnons are still part of the genetic makeup of Europe. My own genetic makeup is that of southern England, and many of the roots genetically of southern Englishmen go back to the Ice Age. And in all Europeans, or many Europeans, there are traces of genetic makeup from the Cro-Magnons. And remember, all of us ascended what Stephen Gay Gould, the Harvard biologist, once called a single African twig. And we haven't been around in human history terms very long. Human existence, maybe 2 million years or more. Modern humans, 200,000 years. We're young. But yeah, there's Cro-Magnon in me, and I'm proud of it. There are people who accuse me of behaving like a Neanderthal, but there's Cro-Magnon in me.
What about the Neanderthals? Why did they disappear?
Nobody knows. Probably because their life way became no longer viable, probably because large numbers of groups lost viable breeding capability. Women died out. Women died in childbirth. And eventually there were not enough people of breeding age around. Some were killed. Others may have starved to death. We don't know. But most likely it's a question of maladaptation.
And we have another question from the chat from Sonic Squirrel.
One of the reasons that I appreciate Professor Fagan's work is his focus on interdisciplinary study and his uncanny ability to view the big picture when discussing questions of the past. Can you suggest ways for the researchers and students of today to strive for the multidisciplinary approach that has been so useful for you?
That is a very, very fascinating and very topical question. One of the biggest problems in science of all types, and archaeology is but one and climatology is another, is how incredibly specialized they have got. And I can produce you archaeologists who will know all about the archaeology of the Ohio Valley, but if you ask them about Florida, they'll look at you as if you're crazy. Their world is Ohio. The reason for this is partly, and this is of course a very simple answer to a complex question, the publish or perish culture. We live in a culture where research is the great god at many universities, where graduate programs have professors who train yet more professors and PhDs, and almost invariably, with many professors, those students are clones of themselves, and they're ever more specialized versions of themselves. And you tend to research for smaller and smaller audiences. The difficulty of writing for a larger audience is that you have to step right out of your comfort zone. I was very lucky. I was trained at Cambridge University many years ago by a series of professors who had the big view. And they wanted us to take the big view. And they wanted us to leave England, and I went to Africa, and work in the world. And the result is one thought much more of the world on a global scale. And that was one part of why I'm the way I am. But it's very difficult. You can't train someone to be multidisciplinary unless the academic structure allows it. And this is fortunately beginning to happen largely, or in part, because of biology and also because of climatology, which rely on many disciplines. I also had another very seminal experience. In my 20s, I was heavily involved in the development of multidisciplinary Black African history in Africa, where there was almost nothing in written records, where we had to rely on oral tradition, archaeology, anthropology, and everything. And when I came to this country, it stuck with me. And as I got involved in writing books for the wider audience, it really stuck with me. And the first book I wrote on climatology was a book on El Nino, the history of El Nino, which began with a small coffee klatch of writers in the middle of a rainstorm who said to me, "Brian, why don't you write a book of the history of the El Nino?" And I said, "I don't think anyone's done that." And I went away and I sat down and I wrote a book proposal in 3 hours because all the stories were there. It never occurred to me that part of it was history and part of it was climatology. And to me, there's humanity. There's the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals. These are people. How we study them is only important in that we use the most appropriate approaches to do it. The hardest thing for me to do, or was when I was a teacher, was to convince people this was the way to look at the world. And the reason I look at it the way I am is that I am at this point a writer for general audiences and I have to tell stories. I hope that's a convincing answer.
Well, we here at Skeptically Speaking not only like stories, we like the big view. So thank you very much for being here, Brian.
My pleasure. You're a delight to talk to.
Thank you. You can find links to Brian Fagan and Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans, on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. And we'll be right back with Daniel Loxton, author of the new book, Ankylosaur Attack, right after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we'll find out what we know and what we want to know about the brain in an interview recorded live at DragonCon 2011. We'll discuss the history and practice of neurology with academic clinical neurologist Dr. Stephen Novella and Dr. Jason Schneiderman, postdoctoral research fellow at the Psychiatry Neuroimaging Laboratory at Harvard Medical. And we're joined by researcher Dr. Gary Wells to discuss his new study on the accuracy of eyewitnesses and photo lineup methods. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking on your local radio station or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
I'm here with Daniel Loxton, editor of Junior Skeptic, the 10-page kids' science section in Skeptic magazine. He's also the author and illustrator of the award-winning children's book, Evolution, How We and All Living Things Came to Be. He has a new book out, Ankylosaur Attack. Welcome back, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us about the new book.
The new book, Ankylosaur Attack, is a bit of a departure for me. It's for an even younger audience, ages 4 and up, and it's a kid's storybook about dinosaurs, about a day in the life of an armored plant eater called an ankylosaur, and the various jeopardies that he gets himself into during the course of the day.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like you're not just trying to teach kids about dinosaurs. There seems to be another lesson with this book as well.
The story straddles the line between having a little bit of a moral lesson about sticking together and helping out your friends in a time of need, and on the other hand, trying to avoid anthropomorphizing these animals. So it's a natural history-inspired book. It is fiction, but the animals don't have names. I try not to give them complex thoughts. They don't have language. They don't talk to each other. They're just animals interacting in an environment that is something like they could have lived in.
But not to worry anybody, there is science.
It's as fact-based as I knew how to make it. this is an environment very much like they would have lived in. And the species that interact in the story actually lived at the same time. We brought in a little bit of expert oversight, especially for the last. There's a page of science exposition at the end of the book, and I got that reviewed by one of the world's leading experts on ankylosaurs, actually.
The story itself is lovely, definitely, but it's the pictures, Daniel. They are amazing, as usual. Brilliantly realistic for anybody who's never seen Daniel's art. So how did you create them?
Well, we got in a time machine and we went and found dinosaurs. I mean, the goal was to make it look like that. So these are computer-generated dinosaurs in locations that were shot on location in British Columbia. The locations are modified heavily. The dinosaurs are created in a computer and then brought into these environments, and the magic happens at the end when you're putting all these elements together to create something which hopefully fools the eye. It's funny, I go through the process of building these things up into something that really looks as real as possible, and then I break back down some of that realism. So, the light is just a little bit more dramatic than you're liable to find with your camera out in the outdoors, but it's meant to fool the eye.
Well, even the difference between the young dinosaur and the old dinosaur, it is very realistic.
Thank you.
Well, now you've recently seen some controversy around your last book, Evolution, How We and All Living Things Came to Be. Tell us about that.
Well, it's been quite the week. Evolution has been out for like a year and a half, but it just hit the mainstream in a big way in terms of its press. It's been featured in the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Vancouver Sun, all over the place. I've been fielding calls from major television news networks, and all surrounding its nomination and win, thankfully, for the Lane Anderson Award. It's been recognized now as Canada's best children's science book.
Well, congratulations on the award, but what was the controversy exactly then?
Well, the controversy is that it was snapped up by the largest children's publisher in Canada, Kids Can Press, and celebrated as now the best science book for kids in the country, to my great shock and honor. But the same book had been rejected by a number of U.S. publishers. In fact, we failed to find a publisher for Evolution in the United States. That's how we wound up looking back on my home turf in Canada for a publisher. And when we were looking for a publisher, a U.S. publisher, talking to some of these names that you would recognize, many of the publishing professionals I spoke to indicated that they thought the topic was just too politically charged somehow. It was too hot. It was not the right time for this. It could be a problem to get it into needed distribution channels, especially those ones that are plugged into schools. So this became the news story over the last week, was just the irony that the American publishers rejected a book which is now recognized as being very good kid science.
So what's sort of the American perspective on that?
I have a lot of sympathy for American publishers. We spoke to some great people, and they kept saying, we love the book. Everyone here at the office loves the book. We just think it could be a problem. And in this time, with so much riding on every decision in the publishing world, with the culture turning its back on the medium, maybe, it's just it's a dangerous time for editors to take risks, for publishers to take risks, which makes it all the more laudable, I think, that Kids Can Press, which is as part of the corporate media giant chorus, they jumped on it with both feet. I'm very, very proud to have Kids Can promoting the project, supporting it, and from the get-go insisting that it be accurate.
So you won the award kind of right in the midst of this media interest, extravaganza, I should say, around the book. So does this feel like a bit of vindication?
Yes, it does. The Globe and Mail story came out last Wednesday, and it blew up. Last I looked, 4,000 people had shared this story on Facebook. It was spinning off all across the internet, and that night they announced its win for the Lane Anderson Award. So it was extraordinarily exciting timing. I was really at the edge of my seat for that whole thing. And the ride may not even be over. Evolution, How We and All Living Things Came to Be is also nominated for the Norma Fleck Award which it would recognize the Canada's best nonfiction book for kids. So there's some steep competition, but it's got a 1 in 5 chance. So,
well, obviously, good luck. But
thank you.
Back to the less controversial new book, Ankylosaur Attack. I'm wondering, what would you say is the difference between your book and maybe most kids' dinosaurs books?
Well, I think the main difference is in the art. It's what's being called out by Kirkus Reviews and other reviewers as Kirkus. They were very kind. They said that even by today's extraordinarily high standards, this is unusually photorealistic. And the secret is that making dinosaurs look this real is not remotely economical for a print book. It doesn't really make any economic sense. Usually when you see these kind of very tightly rendered CG dinosaurs in a book, it's because it's attached to a television production of some sort. So like Walking with Dinosaurs is a really good example. There are several spin-off books associated with that BBC series. Well, the TV budget paid for building those dinosaurs. In my case, Jim Smith and I, as the illustration team, we basically just built it with gumballs and gumption and baling twine, kind of A-team style, and it looks good, I dare say. But the reason there's not so much competition in this particular way of doing dinosaur books for print is that it really doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'm very glad you did it. It was very worth it. For me.
Thank you. Well, we have to do it 3 more times. It's only the first book in a series, Tales of Prehistoric Life.
And we will have you on to talk about every single one of those. Congratulations again, Daniel, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
You can find links to Daniel Loxton and Ankylosaur Attack on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. Since you're there, why not click the other links to Facebook, to Twitter, and to iTunes, where you can listen to archived episodes, subscribe to the show, or leave a review. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking. One last thing. In case you haven't heard already, there's been some exciting dinosaur news. A team of scientists, led by University of Alberta researcher Ryan McKellar, have identified an absolutely stunning collection of prehistoric feathers from the late Cretaceous period. 4,000 amber samples collected in Grassy Lake, Alberta, revealed a range of simple proto-feathers from early feathered dinosaurs and more advanced structures that track the development of feathers like those in modern birds. Some of the feathers were so well preserved that the researchers believe that they've been able to figure out what color they were when they were first stuck to that ancient tree sap. And it turns out that some dinosaurs may have been a lot flashier than we thought. It's not Jurassic Park, but we'll take it. The study was published in the journal Science, and you'll find links to coverage, including photos, on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. Thanks for listening.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov's spells. Cause we're skeptically speaking, our mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon-bending mind tricks. All the humbug, flim-flam, frauds and shams, the charlatan who I don't think you understand. It's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor, leave the pieces alone, we don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Skeptically Speaking is produced with the support of CJSR 88.5 FM in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Our studio assistants are Brent Kelly and Rochelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our studio technician and research assistant. The show is produced and edited by K.O. Myers. Our theme song was written and recorded by AOK. And I'm your host, Desiree Schell.